The Burning Crusade was the last expansion where priests had their own racials. For those of you who don't know, priests used to have extra racials in addition to their normal racials, like how only priest dwarves knew how to use Fear Ward, meaning other races of priests couldn't use the ability, and other classes of dwarves also didn't know it. I have an entire video that goes over all the racials in detail, but for now I'll give you a little summary of all of them. Undead priests had Touch of Weakness and Devouring Plague. Touch of Weakness was a debuff that would activate when the priest was attacked, and Devouring Plague was a strong dot that healed you on a cooldown. Trolls had Shadow Guard and Hex of Weakness. Shadow Guard was like a shadow version of Lightning Shield, and Hex of Weakness was a debuff that lowered damage by a tiny amount, and reduced healing received by 20%. It was also the priest's only curse effect they ever had in the game. Blood Elves had Touch of Weakness and Consume Magic. Touch of Weakness was the exact same as the Undead's racial, and Consume Magic allowed the Blood Elf to dispel one of its own buffs to restore mana, and only one of the buffs that he cast on himself. So Power Word Fortitude, Inner Fire, and Touch of Weakness were the only buffs that could be consumed. Night Elves had Star Shards and Elun's Grace. Star Shards was a dot with a cool looking effect, and Elun's Grace was like a mini evasion, in that it increased your chance for things to miss you while active. Dwarves had 3 racials in BC, only because Fear Ward was one of the racials at the start of the expansion, and was taken away from them and made baseline towards the end. So they were given a new racial. The other 2 racials dwarves had were Desperate Prayer and Chastise. Desperate Prayer was an instant cast self-heal on a long cooldown, and Chastise was pretty similar to Holy Word Chastise that Holy Priests have today, in that it did a tiny bit of damage and incapacitated the target for a bit. Humans had Desperate Prayer and Feedback. Desperate Prayer was the same as the dwarves, and Feedback was a buff that would drain mana and do damage to whoever had attacked the priest with the spell while the buff was active. And finally we have the Draenei, who had Symbol of Hope, Fear Ward, and Chastise as their racials. When Fear Ward was made baseline to all priests, they were given Chastise along with dwarves, and Symbol of Hope essentially gave everyone in the Draenei's party a fixed amount of mana every 5 seconds for 15 seconds on a 5-minute cooldown. Funny enough, this spell was removed under the Burning Crusade, and brought back very recently in Legion as a priest talent, which allows the priest to channel for 10 seconds to allow all other healers in their raid to cast spells for no mana during the duration. And those were the only races that could be priests at the time, in case you're wondering what racials Taurens had or whatever. Speaking of racial specific abilities, Paladins also had faction specific abilities. Prior to the Burning Crusade, only Alliance players could be Paladins. But with the addition of Blood Elves to the Horde, the Paladin class became available to both sides. In an attempt to keep the factions separate, 2 faction-specific seals were added to the game. Alliance Paladins received Seal of Vengeance, while Horde Paladins got Seal of Blood. Oddly enough, the 2 seals had completely different game mechanics. Seal of Vengeance was very similar to Seal of Truth ability Paladins had before Legion removed it, which was pretty much the default Ret Pally seal to use for max damage. Seal of Vengeance caused the Paladin's melee attacks to apply a stacking dot debuff to the target, which caused holy damage, and increased the damage of judgment against the target. Seal of Blood caused the Paladin's weapon attacks to deal additional holy damage equal to a percentage of their weapon damage. Since it scaled off weapon damage and provided consistent damage, it was widely considered to be the best Ret Pally seal. Interestingly enough, the seal had a backlash damage mechanic, where the Paladin took damage equal to 10% of the damage the seal dealt as well. Thus, its use could occasionally be dangerous to the player, and kill you sometimes. Flasks and elixirs could be used at the same time, but not only that, you could also have multiple elixirs up at the same time, along with your flask food buffs and a few other random buffs. The normal raid buffs needed for Warlords of Draenor were simply 3 things: a flask, food buff, and an augment rune. An average raid of about 3 hours or so would require 3 flasks and 20 stack of food and runes if you didn't have the permanent one. Now let's take a look at the average raid buffs a caster had to bring with them to a raid. 20 elixirs of master, which gave about plus 15 to all stats. Remember, elixirs don't last through death like flasks. 20 elixirs of major firepower, 20 elixirs of vitality, and 20 adepts elixirs. Then you had to get 20 Ramsey Rum Black's label. Because at the time when you could stack elixirs, you could also stack certain food buffs, and Rumsey's Rum Black label gave extra stamina. But in order to get this drink, you had to go into the old Hillsbrad Foothills instance and buy them from a vendor. Not the normal Hillsbrad, but the past version in the Caverns of Time. or you just had to farm the item out in the world other ways. Then of course you had normal food buffs times 20, and 20 flame cap. Flame caps were a weird herb you could gather in Zangamarsh that wasn't used in any recipes, and instead had an on-use effect that gave you a chance to do a little extra fire damage with attacks, and a spell power buff for 1 minute. And last but not least, your 4 flasks of supreme power. So that's 4 different elixirs, 2 food buffs, 1 consumable, and 1 flask. And that's not including the potions. The Burning Crusade was the last expansion with bosses that had straight up magic immunities. For those of you who don't know, lots of bosses in vanilla had lore-specific spell immunities, like how Ragnaros was immune to fire damage because he was made of fire. In the Burning Crusade, the Void Reaver in Tempest Keep was immune to poisons because he's a machine. TBC was also the last expansion with widespread use of resist gear. Wrath of the Lich King had some fights that were made easier with resist gear, like frost resist gear for tanks on Sindragosa, but it wasn't really mandatory. Then in Cataclysm, resist gear wasn't even really a thing, and only high-end raid guilds would use resist trinkets on some fights. Then Blizzard just straight up removed resistances later on, after making them less important each expansion since the Burning Crusade. The trash before Hydros in the Serpentine Caverns had too much health and took an unreasonable amount of time to kill. The trash also had about a 40-minute respawn timer, which usually meant you only got about 20 minutes of attempts on Hydros before you had to start clearing trash again. And since Hydros himself required the tanks to get a set of frost resist gear, most guilds had to simply work on other bosses and keep clearing the trash over and over, because a decent set of frost resist gear was very time consuming to get, and the trash would just keep spawning until you killed Hydros. Several tier 5 bosses which were unkillable were stealth fixed with no official notification by Blizzard, so when the bosses were made killable, none of the top guilds were even trying them, and the first kills went to lesser known guilds. It may seem hard to believe that top guilds would simply stop working on bosses, but bosses like Lady Vosh and Kel were literally unkillable in their first incarnations for months, and sometimes the top guilds who kept working on them even though they were unkillable would lose their world first simply because the fight was changed while they were asleep, and some other guild who just happened to be in the right place at the right time and got the kill on the new, significantly easier to kill boss. Blizzard was really shit with fixing bosses in this time. Some of the gear in Karazhan, one of the first raids you could do in the Burning Crusade, was actually worse than some heroic dungeon pieces, until Blizzard buffed the gear later on. Guild banks, daily quests, gems, and jewel crafting were all things added in the Burning Crusade. In vanilla, guilds would just trade everything with each other. Gear didn't have gem slots, and since daily quests weren't a thing, getting gold for the average player in vanilla was quite difficult. With the introduction of daily quests in TBC, the average player could actually earn gold casually without having to farm or play the auction house. Despite being on the box and intro cinematic, Illidan wasn't the final boss of the expansion, and wasn't even in the final raid. This didn't happen again until Warlords, when Grom was promised to be the final fight, and it ended up as Archimonde at the last second. In fact, we save Grom and he helps us kill the final boss. Imagine if we ended up saving Illidan instead of fighting him, and then he helped us fight the Burning Legion. Oh wait. Sunwell, the last raid of the expansion, was one of the hardest raids ever. Muru and Kil'jaeden are 2 of the hardest bosses that were not unkillable ever put in the game, and both are in the same instance. Muru, who isn't even the final boss of the raid, is considered the hardest boss ever made by many people who did the fight when it was current. If you want to learn more about those 2 fights and what made them so difficult, just watch my video on the top 10 hardest raid bosses. Also, if you want to learn more about how bullshit some of the bosses in the expansion were, I go into a lot of detail on some of the worst in my top 10 unkilled raid bosses video, and in my top 10 glitchiest raid boss video. All 3 of these videos will be linked at the end of the video right now.